January 8th is cursed in rock and roll history, and two of music's greatest icons prove it. Elvis Presley was born on January 8th, 1935. David Bowie was born on January 8th, 1947, exactly 12 years later. For most of their lives, this seemed like nothing more than a curious coincidence, a bit of trivia that music journalists would mention in passing. But on January 8th, 2016, David Bowie died on his 69th birthday, releasing his final album Blackstar just 2 days before his death. The date suddenly took on eerie significance, particularly when combined with Bowie's complicated relationship with Elvis and his fear of ending up like the king, bloated, drug-addicted, a parody of his former self. Bowie had spent decades trying to avoid Elvis's fate, deliberately staying thin, constantly reinventing himself, refusing to become a nostalgia act, performing his greatest hits in increasingly sad venues. And yet he died on the same date Elvis was born, as if some cosmic force had tied their fates together from the beginning. The mystical connection between these two men went deeper than shared birthdays, touching on questions of fame, mortality, and whether artistic genius comes with a price that must eventually be paid. If you want to discover how a shared birthday connected two legends across time and death, subscribe to our channel now. Because the January 8th curse is stranger than anyone imagined. Elvis Aaron Presley entered the world on January 8th, 1935, in a two-room shotgun house in Tupelo, Mississippi. His twin brother Jesse Garin was stillborn, and Elvis would carry the weight of being the surviving twin for his entire life, often speaking about feeling incomplete, as if part of him had died with his brother. Exactly 12 years later, on January 8th, 1947, David Robert Jones was born in Brixton, London, to a working-class family, recovering from World War II. Neither birth seemed particularly auspicious or marked by destiny. Elvis grew up in grinding poverty in the American South, while David grew up in the gray austerity of post-war Britain. But both boys were drawn to music with an intensity that suggested something deeper than ordinary talent or ambition. Elvis absorbed gospel, blues, and country, creating a synthesis that would revolutionize popular music. David absorbed Little Richard, Elvis himself, and the theatrical traditions of British music hall, eventually creating personas and characters that would expand what popular music could express and represent. The 12-year gap between their births meant that by the time Bowie was becoming aware of music and culture, Elvis was already a phenomenon. The young David Jones watched Elvis on television and understood immediately that this was someone who had broken all the rules, who had proven that you could be working class and poor and still become a god, that sexuality and danger and rebellion could be packaged and sold to a mass audience. Elvis became one of Bowie's earliest idols, a template for how ambition and charisma could transcend the limitations of birth and circumstance. But Bowie was also watching from Britain, which gave him a different perspective than American fans. He saw Elvis as an American phenomenon, something exotic and dangerous that represented everything Britain wasn't: sexually liberated, racially integrated, constantly moving forward rather than looking back. This outsider perspective would later influence how Bowie thought about fame and performance, seeing stardom as something you could construct and deconstruct rather than something that simply happened to you. By the 1960s, Elvis and Bowie's careers were moving in dramatically different directions, though both were navigating the complexities of fame and artistic identity. Elvis, after his revolutionary impact in the 1950s, had been drafted into the military and then returned to find the music landscape changed. The Beatles and British invasion bands had absorbed his influence and created something new, and Elvis found himself being managed by Colonel Tom Parker into increasingly safe, commercial territory. He made movies, dozens of formulaic films, where he played similar characters and sang forgettable songs. He performed in Las Vegas, catering to older audiences who wanted nostalgic entertainment rather than artistic challenge. The dangerous rebel who had scandalized America with his hip movements became a reliable entertainer, wealthy and famous, but creatively neutered. By the early 1970s, Elvis was trapped in a cycle of Vegas performances and prescription drug use, his weight ballooning, his performances becoming parodies of his former intensity. Bowie, meanwhile, was spending the 1960s struggling to find his identity and breakthrough. He released multiple albums that failed commercially, experimented with different styles and personas, couldn't quite figure out how to package his ambitions in a way that connected with audiences. But he was learning from Elvis's trajectory, watching the King's descent into safe nostalgia, and understanding that commercial success without artistic evolution was a kind of death. When Bowie finally achieved breakthrough success with Ziggy Stardust in 1972, he did so with a character that was the opposite of late-period Elvis: androgynous, dangerous, constantly evolving, willing to alienate audiences rather than simply please them. And crucially, Bowie killed Ziggy on stage in 1973, announcing the character's death to a shocked audience, refusing to become trapped in a single identity the way Elvis had been trapped in his. This willingness to destroy his own successful creation and start over was Bowie's way of ensuring he would never end up like Elvis, never become a prisoner of his own past successes. August 16, 1977. Elvis Presley was found dead in the bathroom of his Graceland mansion in Memphis, Tennessee. He was 42 years old. The official cause of death was cardiac arrhythmia, but everyone understood the real cause: years of prescription drug abuse, terrible diet, and the physical and psychological toll of being Elvis Presley. The autopsy revealed a body destroyed by excess, an enlarged heart, a colon twice the normal size, multiple drugs in his system, including codeine, morphine, and Valium. The images from his final performances showed a man who looked decades older than his actual age, sweating through jumpsuit performances, forgetting lyrics, sometimes barely able to stand. This was not how rock and roll gods were supposed to die. This was not the rebel who had changed American culture. This was a cautionary tale about what fame could do to you if you weren't careful, if you let other people control your career, if you stopped evolving and started simply existing on past glories. David Bowie was in Berlin when Elvis died, in the middle of creating the albums that would become the Berlin Trilogy, recovering from his own near-death experience with cocaine addiction. The news of Elvis's death hit him hard, but not with simple grief. Bowie saw in Elvis's bloated corpse a warning about his own possible future, a glimpse of what could happen if he didn't stay vigilant about his own health and artistic direction. In interviews following Elvis's death, Bowie was surprisingly harsh, describing Elvis's final years as a tragedy of wasted potential, criticizing the Las Vegas performances as artistic suicide, and making it clear that he had no intention of following that path. Some critics found Bowie's comments callous, but they weren't really about Elvis. They were about Bowie's own terror of becoming a faded version of himself. The January 8th birthday they shared suddenly felt ominous rather than coincidental, as if the same date that had given birth to both of them was also a marker of some shared destiny that Bowie was now determined to avoid. For the next 4 decades, from 1977 until his death in 2016, David Bowie structured his entire career around not becoming Elvis. This fear manifested in multiple ways, some healthy and some borderline obsessive. Bowie became fanatical about his weight, maintaining a thin physique even as he aged, conscious that Elvis's bloat had been both physical reality and symbolic representation of artistic decline. He refused to become a nostalgia act, deliberately avoiding the obvious commercial path of touring on greatest hits and instead continuing to release new material that took risks and sometimes alienated fans who wanted him to stay the same. He rejected offers to headline Vegas residencies or oldies tours, understanding that these were the traps that had ensnared Elvis, comfortable financial arrangements that destroyed artistic vitality. And he maintained obsessive control over his own career and image, never allowing a Colonel Parker figure to dictate his artistic direction for financial reasons. This anti-Elvis philosophy drove some of Bowie's most interesting and challenging artistic choices. The electronic experimentation of the Berlin Trilogy, the avant-garde theater rock of the 1990s, the drum and bass-influenced Earthling album, the complete retirement from touring in the 2000s. All of these decisions made sense as strategies for avoiding Elvis's fate. Bowie would rather fail trying something new than succeed repeating something old. He would rather be criticized for being weird and difficult than praised for being reliable and nostalgic. And he would rather risk his legacy with challenging late-period work than protect it by becoming a living museum of his own past. This approach didn't always work commercially. Several of his 1980s and 1990s albums were critical and commercial disappointments, but it kept him artistically vital in a way that Vegas-era Elvis hadn't been. Bowie remained interesting, unpredictable, dangerous even as he aged, deed that was worth more to him than financial security or safe adulation. In early 2014, David Bowie received his cancer diagnosis. The liver cancer was aggressive and the prognosis was terminal. His doctors gave him perhaps 2 years with treatment. Most artists in this situation would have retired, spent their remaining time with family, tried to find peace in whatever way made sense to them. But Bowie, with characteristic control and ambition, decided to create one final album, to choreograph his own death as he had choreographed every other major moment of his career. And he decided, whether consciously or unconsciously, that this final album would be released on January 8th, his birthday, the date he shared with Elvis, the date that had connected them across time and now would mark his departure. The decision felt loaded with meaning, as if Bowie was acknowledging the mystical connection he had spent decades trying to escape, accepting that the calendar had always suggested some kind of shared destiny. The Blackstar album, recorded in secret during 2015, while Bowie underwent treatment that he knew was ultimately futile, was unlike anything he had created before. It was dark, jazz-influenced, filled with references to death and transcendence. The title track featured lyrics about being a black star, about something falling from the sky, about transformation through death. The Lazarus track opened with the line, "Look up here, I'm in heaven," and included imagery of being in hospital beds and buttons sewn over eyes like coins on corpses. Every element of the album was deliberately constructed to be experienced twice. Once as mysterious art while he was alive, once as confession and farewell after his death. And the release date of January 8th, 2016, his 69th birthday, meant that the album would exist for exactly 2 days before his death transformed its meaning completely. When Bowie died on January 10th, 2016, the world suddenly understood that Blackstar had been a musical suicide note, a death letter released on the same date Elvis had been born, as if Bowie was acknowledging that the ghost had finally caught him. After Bowie's death, numerologists and pattern seekers had a field day with the connections between him and Elvis. Born 12 years apart, which some numerologists argued was significant because 12 is the number of completion in many mystical traditions. Both reached their commercial peaks in their 20s and struggled with different challenges in their 40s. Elvis died at 42, which breaks down to 4 plus 2 equals 6. Bowie died at 69, which breaks down to 6 plus 9 equals 15, which breaks down to 1 plus 5 equals 6. Both died in January, though different dates. Both released final albums that fans and critics would later recognize as being about death, though only Bowie did so deliberately. Both had complicated relationships with their fathers and used performance as escape from difficult childhoods. Both created iconic personas that threatened to consume their real identities. Elvis the King, Bowie the Starman. Both influenced fashion and challenged social norms around masculinity. Both had periods of severe substance abuse that nearly killed them. The list of connections and parallels could be extended almost indefinitely, each one feeding into the theory that their fates were somehow cosmically intertwined. But beyond numerology and mysticism, there was a simpler explanation for the connections. They were both artists, operating in the same industry, facing similar pressures and challenges. The temptations of fame, the difficulty of maintaining artistic integrity while achieving commercial success, the physical and psychological toll of constant performance and public scrutiny. These were universal problems that any successful musician would face. What made Elvis and Bowie's relationship to these problems interesting was how differently they responded. Elvis, particularly after Parker's management took over, chose safety and commercial reliability, which led to artistic stagnation and eventually physical and psychological deterioration. Bowie chose risk and constant reinvention, which led to uneven commercial results but sustained artistic vitality. And yet, both men died, connected by the calendar, January 8th, linking them at birth and death, as if the universe was suggesting that different strategies ultimately led to the same destination. The greatest irony of the January 8th curse is that Bowie spent decades trying to avoid Elvis's fate, and in many ways succeeded. He stayed thin, stayed artistically vital, controlled his own career, but still died on their shared birthday, as if all his efforts to escape the pattern had been futile. Or perhaps the real irony is that Bowie did escape Elvis's fate by dying the way he did. Elvis died at 42, bloated and drugged, a parody of his former self, having not created meaningful new work in years. Bowie died at 69, still at a healthy weight, having just released an album that critics called a masterpiece, completely in control of his own narrative and image. Elvis died in a bathroom, alone, found hours later in an undignified position. Bowie died surrounded by family, having said goodbye, having prepared everyone as much as possible for what was coming. Elvis's death was a tragedy of wasted potential and lost control. Bowie's death was a tragedy because he was still creating vital work, but it was also a triumph of control and artistic integrity maintained until the very end. Perhaps the January 8th connection wasn't a curse, but simply a marker, a date that produced two kinds of genius who would navigate fame in different ways and end up illustrating different possibilities. Elvis showed what happens when you let the industry shape you, when you prioritize safety over risk, when you become trapped in your own mythology. Bowie showed what happens when you fight against the industry's expectations, when you prioritize artistic evolution over commercial calculation, when you constantly kill and resurrect yourself rather than allowing one version to become permanent. Both approaches came with costs. Elvis had more commercial success and financial security, but lost himself in the process. Bowie had more artistic respect and personal integrity, but endured commercial failures and constant financial pressure. And both died too young, Elvis at 42 and Bowie at 69, though 69 feels tragically young when the person dying is still creating meaningful work. Since Bowie's death on January 8, 2016, the date has taken on new significance in rock and roll culture. Fans gather to celebrate both Elvis's birthday and mourn Bowie's death, the two events now forever linked by the calendar. Social media fills with tributes and discussions about the mystical connection, theories about whether Bowie deliberately chose to release Blackstar on that date as acknowledgement of the cosmic pattern. Music journalists write annual pieces about the curse, examining the parallels and differences between the two men, debating whether their shared birthday meant anything or was simply coincidence, given weight by human pattern-seeking instincts. And younger musicians, particularly those who cite Bowie as an influence, study his career as a manual for how to navigate fame without becoming Elvis, how to maintain artistic integrity while achieving commercial success, how to age without becoming irrelevant or self-parodying. The curse, if it was a curse, also serves as a reminder about the price of artistic genius and the difficulty of sustaining creativity over decades. Both Elvis and Bowie burned bright. Both changed popular culture fundamentally. Both influenced countless artists who came after them. But the energy required to maintain that level of innovation and impact is exhausting, and the pressures of fame and success create temptations and traps that most people cannot imagine. Elvis fell into those traps and couldn't escape. Bowie saw what happened to Elvis and spent 40 years fighting to avoid the same fate, succeeding in most ways, but ultimately unable to escape the calendar that had connected them from birth. The fact that Bowie died on January 8th, after decades of consciously trying to be everything Elvis wasn't, suggests that some patterns are stronger than individual will or artistic ambition, that fate has a dark sense of irony, and that the price of genius might be written in the stars, or at least in the calendar, from the very beginning.